At 14:30 on January 8, 1945, Technical Sergeant Russell Dunham was crouched in snow, reaching his knees at the base of Hill 616 near Kaisersberg, France, observing German automatic weapon fire rip through the wintry expanse above his pinned-down platoon. He was 24 years old, had survived 3 campaigns, and had no intention of perishing that day. The enemy had established 3 MG-42 machine gun nests in timber emplacements, higher up the snow-laden incline, each capable of expelling 1,200 rounds per minute. Dunham's platoon had been advancing through the Alsace-Lorraine territory when they blundered into a deadly trap. Machine gun fire raked down from the crest of the hill, while artillery shells exploded behind them. The only viable direction left was directly upward, a 40-degree slope into overlapping fields of fire. 11 men from the 2nd platoon had already fallen that week, the snow surrounding their position a churned-up crimson. Every soldier in Company Y was acutely aware of the grim statistics. During the Vosges Mountains campaign, the 3rd Infantry Division had suffered more daily casualties than any other American division in Europe. The Germans held the superior elevation, possessing clear lines of sight and ample ammunition. Dunham surveyed the hill. His platoon was 35 yards behind him, pressed flat against the snow, utterly immobilized. Remaining pinned would guarantee their annihilation by German artillery, which would bracket their location. Retreat meant certain death in the open, caught in the crossfire of the machine guns that held them captive. The ambient temperature was 12 degrees Fahrenheit, and the snow lay 18 inches deep. Dunham, clad in standard olive drab wool, presented a dark silhouette against the pristine white landscape. Every other soldier who had attempted movement had been instantly detected and forced back down. The Germans effectively owned that hill. Dunham retreated to the company's position and procured a white mattress cover. He ripped it open and draped it over his uniform like a cloak. He then began his preparations. He stuffed 12 30-round carbine magazines into every available pocket and loop on his uniform. A dozen Mark II fragmentation grenades were secured to his belt, with more attached to his suspenders. He even tucked grenades into the buttonholes of his field jacket. Upon standing, he was burdened with 72 pounds of ordnance and ammunition, in addition to his rifle. His platoon sergeant observed him. Dunham offered no explanation, simply commencing his crawl up the hill. The initial 75 yards took him 18 minutes. He moved during momentary lulls when the German fire shifted to other sectors, pressing himself flat as the MG-42s swept back across his path. The snow saturated his makeshift camouflage, and his hands grew numb. The rifle sling dug into his shoulder from the considerable weight of the grenades. At 75 yards, he was only 10 yards from the first machine gun emplacement. The timber bunker, reinforced with logs, was strategically positioned to provide interlocking fire with the other 2 positions. 3 German soldiers manned the gun, 1 feeding the ammunition belt, 1 firing, and 1 scanning for targets. If you wish to see the outcome of Dunham's mattress cover camouflage, please signify your interest by hitting the like button. Your engagement helps us share more of these overlooked narratives. Consider subscribing if you haven't already. Returning to Dunham's ordeal. Dunham rose to his feet and charged. The Germans spotted his movement. The machine gunner swiveled the weapon toward him. At a range of 6 yards, the gun opened fire. Rounds tore through Dunham's white covering. Then, a rifle bullet struck him across the back, inflicting a 10-inch gash from his left shoulder blade to his spine. The impact spun him completely around, propelling him 15 yards back down the slope into the snow. He landed face down. Blood poured from the wound. saturating the mattress cover and staining the white fabric a vivid crimson against the snow. The pain was agonizing. He could feel the wound stretching with every breath. For 5 seconds, he remained motionless. Then, a German egg grenade landed in the snow barely 2 feet from his head. Dunham kicked it away with his boot. It detonated 5 yards down the slope, close enough that the concussive force lifted him off the ground. Russell Dunham then regained his footing and advanced up the hill, firing his M1 carbine, which still held 28 rounds. The German machine gunner attempted to re-aim the MG-42, but Dunham had already closed within its minimum traverse arc. At 4 yards, he unleashed a 3-round burst into the gunner's chest. The assistant gunner reached for his rifle. Dunham shot him twice. Both Germans fell. The third crew member, the ammunition feeder, raised his hands and began shouting in German. Dunham's carbine was now empty, all 30 rounds expended in 18 seconds. He slung the rifle, seized the German by the collar of his felled greatcoat, and dragged him from the timber emplacement. He then shoved him down the hill toward the American lines. The German half ran, half stumbled through the snow. Dunham's platoon would take him for questioning. Blood was now streaming steadily down Dunham's back. The bullet wound had lacerated muscle and tissue but had narrowly missed his spine by less than 2 inches. Each movement widened the gash. The white mattress cover was soaked crimson from his shoulders to his waist, appearing like a flag against the snowy backdrop. The second machine gun position was 50 yards uphill and to the right. The German crew manning that gun had witnessed Dunham neutralize the first nest. They anticipated his approach and had adjusted their field of fire accordingly. Dunham could discern the timber logs of their emplacement and the dark silhouette of the barrel tracking across the slope. He reloaded his carbine with a fresh 30-round magazine, leaving him with 11 magazines and 10 grenades remaining. He began to move. The Germans opened fire at 40 yards. Rounds snapped past his head and kicked up sprays of snow around his boots. Dunham dropped and crawled. The pain in his back was so intense that he had to pause every few yards to avoid blacking out. He could feel blood pooling inside his uniform. His hands trembled from blood loss and the biting cold, but he persevered. At 25 yards from the second emplacement, he rose to one knee and withdrew 2 Mark II grenades from his belt. He pulled both pins, counted to 2, and hurled them in a high arc toward the timber bunker. The Germans saw them coming. One of them screamed. Both grenades detonated within the emplacement less than half a second apart. The combined blast dislodged logs and equipment, silencing the machine gun. Dunham advanced, carbine raised. Smoke billowed from the shattered emplacement. He could see body parts in the snow. The entire 3-man crew had been killed by the grenades. He pressed on, turning his attention down the slope to the supporting riflemen dug into foxholes around the machine gun position. 6 German infantrymen scrambled from their holes, attempting to escape. Dunham fired at them from 15 yards, expending another full magazine, targeting every visible shape. He hit 3. The others broke and fled uphill, away from the American advance. Dunham let them go, his focus on the final target. The third machine gun was 65 yards further up the slope, the highest position with the best field of fire over the entire American advance. The German crew there had observed Dunham's assault for the past 12 minutes. They knew precisely where he was, knew he was wounded, and recognized his now blood-red coat against the snow from 200 yards. They had him in their sights. Dunham looked up the hill. The barrel of the MG-42 was aimed directly at him. Rifle grenades began exploding in the snow 10 yards from his position. The concussions knocked him sideways. He hit the ground, as machine gun fire tore through the air where he had been standing. He was exposed, with no cover. The blood trail behind him in the snow resembled a road. The Germans on the hilltop would not miss again. Dunham crawled. The third machine gun position was dug into a cluster of timber 40 yards ahead and 30 feet higher in elevation. The Germans had reinforced it with sandbags and positioned it to cover the entire southern approach to Hill 616. Periodically, the MG-42 would fire a burst, walking rounds across the snow in a search pattern. He moved during the brief intervals between bursts. 5 yards, stop, wait for the gun to traverse, 3 more yards. The snow was so cold, it burned his hands. The wound in his back had transitioned from sharp pain to a deep, grinding ache radiating through his entire torso. He had lost so much blood that his vision was beginning to tunnel at the edges, but he still possessed 9 magazines and 8 grenades. At 40 yards from the third position, a rifle grenade exploded 6 yards to his left. The blast threw snow and frozen dirt across his back, and the impact of the shrapnel felt like being kicked by a horse. He couldn't tell if he had been hit again. Everything hurt. He continued crawling, 30 yards, 25. The machine gun fire grew more accurate. The Germans could now see him, even against the snow. The blood had saturated the entire mattress cover, leaving a red trail pointing directly to his position like an arrow. 20 yards, 15. At 15 yards, Dunham ceased crawling and gathered his legs beneath him. He had to time this perfectly. The MG-42 fired in bursts of 8 to 12 rounds, then paused for 2 to 3 seconds while the gunner re-aimed. Dunham counted. Burst 1, 2, 3. He lunged to his feet and staggered forward. The German spotted him immediately. The machine gunner swung the barrel, but Dunham was already in motion, already pulling grenades from his belt. He held 2 Mark II grenades, pins removed. At 10 yards, he threw both. The first grenade struck the sandbags and ricocheted into the emplacement. The second went through the narrow firing slit. Dunham dove flat as both grenades detonated. The blast was immense. Sandbags flew apart. Timber logs cracked and splintered. The machine gun barrel was blown sideways off its mount. Dunham pushed himself up. Smoke billowed from the shattered position. He moved forward, carbine raised, scanning for movement. All 3 crew members were down. One was still attempting to reach for a rifle. Dunham shot him once. The German ceased moving. Then he heard boots crunching in the snow behind him. Dunham spun around. A German rifleman had emerged from a support foxhole perhaps 20 feet away. The German raised his carabiner 98 rifle and fired at point-blank range. The bullet missed Dunham's head by 3 inches. Dunham fired back. His first round struck the German in the throat. His second hit center mass. The German fell backward into the snow, motionless. Dunham stood on the hilltop, breathing heavily. His carbine was empty again. He had fired 175 rounds and thrown 11 grenades. 3 machine gun positions were destroyed. 9 Germans were dead, 7 more wounded, and 2 taken prisoner. His platoon was no longer pinned down. Below him, he could see Company the 1 advancing up the slope, his brother Ralph among them, moving with the 2nd squad. The Germans were retreating to secondary positions further up the ridge. The attack was succeeding. Hill 616 would be in American hands by nightfall. Dunham looked down at his uniform. The white mattress cover was now entirely red, saturated with blood from his neck to his knees. He could feel the wound in his back pulling apart with every breath. The pain was so intense he couldn't think straight. His hands were shaking uncontrollably from shock and blood loss, but he had done it. 120 soldiers from Company Y had been trapped in that valley. Without his assault, they would have been slaughtered by artillery within the hour. Now they were advancing, fighting, and had a chance. Dunham sat down in the snow, awaiting the medics. He didn't believe he was going to die. Not today. The medics reached Dunham 8 minutes after he sat down. They cut away the blood-soaked mattress cover and opened his field jacket to assess the wound. The bullet had carved a 10-inch long, 2-inch deep gash across his back, running from his left shoulder blade toward his spine. The medics could see muscle tissue and exposed bone. They packed the wound with sulfa powder and bandaged it with compression wraps. Then, they administered a shot of morphine and tagged him for evacuation. Dunham refused to leave. He walked back down the hill with company truck, carrying his empty carbine. By the time they reached the battalion aid station at 1800 hours, he had lost so much blood that he collapsed at the entrance. The battalion surgeon examined him and immediately ordered him to the rear for surgery. The wound required stitches, debridement, and at least 2 weeks of recovery before he could resume combat operations. Dunham spent 4 days at the division clearing station. The surgeons cleaned the wound and closed it with 43 stitches. They informed him that the bullet had missed his spinal cord by less than 2 inches. Had the angle been slightly different, he would have been paralyzed from the waist down. If the gash had been 1 inch deeper, it would have completely severed his spine. However, the wound was clean, with no major nerve damage or infection. He would heal. On January 13th, 5 days after the assault on Hill 616, Dunham was released from the clearing station and sent to a rest area 20 miles behind the front lines. The 3rd Infantry Division had been engaged in continuous fighting since landing in southern France in August 1944. The division had pushed through the Vosges Mountains, battled through Strasbourg, and was now involved in Operation Nordwind, the final major German offensive on the Western Front. Casualties had been catastrophic. In December alone, the division had sustained 863 killed and 3,200 wounded. Every rifle company was operating at 60% strength. The replacement pipeline could not keep pace with the losses. Men were being returned to combat before their wounds had fully healed, due to a lack of available personnel. Dunham's wound was still seeping through the bandages. The stitches pulled with every movement. Doctors had advised him he needed 3 more weeks of recovery before returning to duty. However, on January 18th, 10 days after Hill 616, he walked into the Company I command post and reported for duty. His wound was not healed, the stitches still in place, but 2nd Platoon was reduced to 18 men, and they desperately needed every available rifleman. The company commander reviewed Dunham's medical file, then looked at Dunham and assigned him back to his squad without question. They were redeploying north to Holzwehr, a small town 15 miles from the German border. Intelligence indicated the presence of heavy German armor in the area. Panzer units from the 19th Army were conducting spoiling attacks to impede the American advance. Company I was tasked with holding a defensive position on the southern outskirts of town. Dunham rejoined his platoon on January 20th. His brother Ralph was still with the 2nd Squad, still carrying the same Browning automatic rifle he had used since North Africa. They did not discuss Hill 616. There was nothing to say. Everyone in the company knew what had transpired. General Patch himself had visited the battalion on January 16th and requested to meet Dunham. The general had shaken his hand, stating that Dunham's actions had saved the lives of 120 men who would have been killed by artillery had the machine guns not been neutralized. But that was Hill 616. This was Holzwehr, a different engagement, with different stakes. The 3rd Infantry Division was exhausted, understrength, and facing German armor with limited anti-tank support. Every position they held was temporary. Every defensive line was one breakthrough away from collapse. And on the morning of January 22, 1945, 2nd Platoon would find itself surrounded by German tanks with no escape route. Dunham's war was about to become significantly more perilous. At 600 hours on January 22, 1945, German tanks appeared from 3 directions surrounding Company Thurn's position in Holzwehr. Dunham counted 7 Panther tanks and 3 Tiger Wine tanks advancing through the morning fog, their engines rumbling like thunder across the frozen fields. The 3rd Infantry Division lacked armor support in this sector, no tank destroyers, and no artillery within range. 2nd Platoon had 2 bazooka teams with a total of exactly 14 rockets. The German assault originated from the 19th Army's Armored Reserve units, which had been held back during Operation Nordwind and were now being committed to cut off the American salient pushing toward the Rhine. The Panthers advanced from the west in a staggered line across the open farmland. The Tigers moved up from the south, their 88mm guns already traversing to engage any targets showing movement. Company Wood's position was indefensible, occupying a cluster of farm buildings on the southern edge of Holzwehr with no cover, no concealment, and no means to stop 70-ton tanks with frontal armor 8 inches thick. The bazooka teams fired their rockets at maximum range. 2 rockets impacted, but both bounced off the Panther's glacis plate without penetration. The Germans did not even slow their advance. At 6:30, the company commander gave the order to surrender. White flags appeared from 3 buildings. The German tanks halted their advance, and infantry moved forward to take prisoners. 147 men from Company 1 walked out with their hands raised. The Germans disarmed them, searched them, and formed them into columns for transport to prisoner-of-war camps in the rear. Dunham did not surrender. He slipped out the back of the farmhouse while the Germans were processing prisoners and ran west through a line of bare trees toward a cluster of outbuildings 200 yards away. His back wound had reopened during the night. He could feel blood seeping through the bandages beneath his uniform, but he was unwilling to spend the remainder of the war in a prisoner camp. He reached the outbuildings undetected. There were 3 structures: a small barn, a tool shed, and a stone storage building with a wooden door hanging off its hinges. Dunham checked the barn first. It was empty except for rotting hay. The shed contained nothing but broken farm equipment. The storage building held barrels. 6 wooden barrels stood against the far wall, each approximately 4 feet tall and 3 feet in diameter. Dunham lifted the lid off the first barrel. Potatoes, frozen solid. The second barrel was empty. The third barrel contained sauerkraut. The fermented cabbage filled the barrel to within 6 inches of the top, and its smell hit him with overwhelming force. It was pungent and acidic, strong enough to bring tears to his eyes. Dunham glanced back toward the farmhouse. German soldiers were now moving through the area, checking buildings and searching for stragglers. He could hear voices shouting in German and boots crunching on the frozen ground. They would be there in minutes. He climbed into the sauerkraut barrel. The cabbage was cold and slimy, packed so tightly that he had to force his way down into it. He sank up to his chest, then his neck, before pulling the wooden lid over his head and settling into the fermented mass. The smell was suffocating. The brine soaked through his uniform and into the open wound on his back. The sting was excruciating, like acid poured directly into raw tissue. He bit down hard on his tongue to suppress a scream. He could hear the Germans entering the storage building, boots on the stone floor, voices engaged in rapid German conversation, the sound of barrels being kicked and lids being lifted. They were inspecting every container. Dunham held his breath and pressed himself deeper into the sauerkraut. The lid above him remained closed. The Germans moved through the building, checked the other barrels, and departed. Dunham remained in the barrel. He did not move. He barely breathed. The temperature was dropping. Night was approaching, and he had no idea if the Germans would return. Dunham spent 13 hours in the sauerkraut barrel. The temperature dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit after sunset. The brine froze into slush around his body. He could not feel his hands or feet. The wound on his back had gone numb from the cold and the acidic burn of the fermented cabbage. Each passing hour, he shifted his stance minimally, a desperate effort to maintain circulation. Yet the slightest movement sent fresh surges of sour liquid seeping into the gash that marred his back. At 7 in the morning on the 23rd of January, the sun ascended. Dunham perceived slender beams of light penetrating the gaps in the wooden barrel's covering. He strained his ears. Silence. No human voices, no rumbling engines, no crunching footsteps on the frozen earth. The enemy had departed. He remained immobile for another 30 minutes, ensuring their absence. Then, with painstaking slowness, he dislodged the lid and extricated himself from the confines of the barrel. His uniform, saturated with sauerkraut brine, had stiffened to an unyielding state. His extremities bore the stark white pallor of frostbite. The dressings on his spine had disintegrated entirely, leaving the raw wound exposed. A potent aroma of fermented cabbage wafted from him, perceptible from several yards away. Yet he was alive, and he was liberated. He made his way to the entrance of the storage shed and surveyed the surroundings. The farmyard lay deserted. The enemy armor had withdrawn under the cloak of darkness. The forward observation post was abandoned. Save for discarded equipment the enemy had deemed unworthy of salvage. Dunham observed American helmets and rifles scattered across the soiled ground. He needed to advance. He had to reach friendly lines before the enemy's return. But first, a biological necessity pressed upon him. 13 hours spent immobile within the barrel had rendered him nearly paralyzed with discomfort. He stepped from the shed, rounded the structure to the side of the barn, and sought relief against the stone wall. It was then that 2 enemy soldiers emerged. They appeared around the opposite corner of the barn at a casual pace, engaged in hushed conversation. They spotted Dunham instantaneously. Both adversaries raised their firearms and commenced shouting in their native tongue. Dunham elevated his hands. He possessed no visible weapon. His rifle remained concealed within the sauerkraut barrel. He was drenched, coated in the pungent remains of fermented cabbage, and demonstrably unarmed. The enemy soldiers approached with caution. The foremost soldier maintained his weapon trained on Dunham while his companion advanced to conduct a search. The soldier patted down Dunham's field jacket, probing his pockets. He discovered a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes nestled within Dunham's left breast pocket and held them aloft. The other German promptly lowered his rifle and reached for the cigarettes. An immediate dispute arose between the 2 soldiers. The one who had discovered the cigarettes asserted sole claim. The other proposed they divide the spoils. Their argument persisted for 30 seconds. Their sole focus was the cigarettes. Neither soldier completed the search of Dunham. Neither soldier examined his right flank. Neither soldier detected the Colt M1911 pistol secured in a leather shoulder holster concealed beneath his right arm. beneath the fabric of his field jacket. The adversaries finally reached an accord to share the cigarettes, splitting the pack, and gestured for Dunham to commence walking. They escorted him back to the primary thoroughfare where a German Kubelwagen sat idling, its driver anticipating their arrival. The two soldiers propelled Dunham into the rear compartment and took up positions on either side of him. The driver engaged the vehicle's transmission and directed it eastward, towards enemy territory. Dunham occupied the space between his captors, hands resting on his knees, remaining silent. They journeyed for 40 minutes through sparsely populated farmland and small hamlets. At 1100 hours, the driver veered from the main road and halted before a stone chateau that had been repurposed as an enemy command center. The driver uttered a phrase in German, exited the vehicle, and proceeded towards the chateau's entrance, disappearing within. The engine continued to run. The soldier seated to Dunham's left ignited one of the lucky strikes and gazed out the window. The soldier on his right reclined in his seat, closing his eyes. Neither was observing Dunham any longer. He reached beneath his jacket, retrieved the Colt from its holster, pivoted to his right, and discharged the weapon, striking the soldier in the head at point-blank range. The soldier on his left began to turn. Dunham fired twice, striking him in the chest. He then forcibly opened the door, disembarked from the Kubelwagen, and fled towards a tree line approximately 300 yards to the north. Dunham ran. Behind him, he heard commotion emanating from the chateau, followed by the staccato of gunfire. Bullets whistled past his head, kicking up frozen earth at his feet. He did not look back. He reached the tree line and continued his sprint, forging through skeletal branches and brittle undergrowth. The enemy continued firing for another 30 seconds, then ceased. They were not in pursuit. They had prisoners to secure and a command post to maintain. A single escaped American was not deemed worthy of a company-level manhunt. However, Dunham found himself isolated within enemy-controlled territory, bereft of a map, a compass, provisions, and with a pistol holding only 4 cartridges. The wound on his back had reopened during his desperate flight, and he could feel blood once again saturating his uniform. His feet were already rendered insensible by the frostbite, a consequence of his extended confinement in the sauerkraut barrel. The ambient temperature registered 9 degrees Fahrenheit and was steadily declining. He was 30 miles behind enemy lines with no discernible route back to friendly positions. He advanced westward. This was the sole direction that offered any logical recourse. Westward, towards the front. Westward, towards the distant rumble of artillery. Westward, towards anything that was not controlled by the enemy. He continued his trek throughout the afternoon, utilizing tree lines and ditches for concealment, meticulously avoiding roads and settlements. Every 20 minutes, he was compelled to halt and force his frozen extremities to continue moving. The pain in his back had become a relentless presence, a grinding ache that permeated his entire torso with each laborious step. As dusk settled, he discovered the remnants of a destroyed barn and crawled into what remained of the courtyard. He dared not risk a fire. Enemy patrols were ubiquitous. He pulled dried hay over himself for warmth and attempted to rest. The temperature plummeted to 3 degrees Fahrenheit. His uniform remained damp from the sauerkraut brine, and the moisture had frozen into a rigid layer against his skin. He shivered with such intensity that his teeth chattered, cracking together and inflicting a wound upon his tongue. On the second day, he persevered in his westward movement. He traversed frozen fields and deserted roadways. He encountered enemy vehicles on 2 occasions, seeking cover until they had passed. His feet had transitioned from a state of numbness to an agonizing burn. Upon removing his boots that night to inspect them, he observed that his toes had turned a stark black. Second-degree frostbite, possibly third. He replaced his boots and continued walking. Any cessation of movement would prove fatal. On the third day, the 25th of January, he detected the sound of American artillery. The noise emanated from the west, a persistent barrage from 15mm howitzers firing in unison. He followed the sound. By mid-afternoon, he could discern plumes of smoke rising above the tree line, indicative of American positions. He was nearing friendly lines, perhaps 5 miles, perhaps less. At 1600 hours, Dunham emerged from a copse of trees and beheld the Ill River. A steel bridge spanned the waterway, and on the opposite bank, American engineers were engaged in reinforcing the structure with timber supports. Dunham commenced walking towards them. The engineers observed his approach and raised their rifles. He was clad in a German-issue field jacket, salvaged from a disabled supply truck the previous day. He bore the appearance of an enemy combatant. Dunham raised his hands and shouted his nationality. The engineers maintained their weapons trained on him. He vocally declared his name, his rank, and his unit. One of the engineers lowered his weapon and signaled him forward. Dunham crossed the bridge, his ability to walk severely compromised. His feet were in a catastrophic state. His back wound had become infected. He had lost 20 pounds in 3 days. He collapsed at the far end of the bridge. A medic appeared. Dunham recognized him. Corporal Henderson from the battalion aid station. Henderson examined Dunham's feet, then his spinal wound, and immediately requested a stretcher. They placed Dunham onto a truck and transported him to the division clearing station. The surgeons there labored for 6 hours in an attempt to prevent the amputation of his feet. They meticulously cleaned the infected wound on his back and initiated a regimen of sulfa drugs to combat the infection. 3 days later, while Dunham was recuperating in a hospital bed, a lieutenant from division headquarters entered the ward and informed him that his company commander had submitted a recommendation for the Distinguished Service Cross. But the regimental commander had amended it, and the division commander had subsequently approved it. Technical Sergeant Russell Dunham was to be awarded the Medal of Honor for his extraordinary actions at Hill 616. On the 23rd of April, 1945, Technical Sergeant Russell Dunham stood at attention in Zeppelin Stadium in Nuremberg, Germany. Prior to the war, the stadium had served as the venue for Nazi Party rallies. Now, it was a landscape of rubble and shattered concrete, occupied by American forces. Lieutenant General Alexander Patch, commander of the 7th Army, stood before him, holding the Medal of Honor. Patch read the official citation aloud. The arduous ascent of Hill 616, the 3 enemy machine gun emplacements, the 10-inch wound, the enemy grenade dislodged, 9 enemy combatants neutralized, 7 wounded, 2 taken prisoner, 175 rounds of carbine ammunition expended, 11 grenades deployed, and 120 American soldiers preserved from certain demise. Then, Patch placed the medal around Dunham's neck and spoke words not included in the official commendation. He stated that in 30 years of military service, he had never witnessed a single soldier alter the course of an entire engagement through sheer valor and an unyielding refusal to yield. He remarked that Russell Dunham had fought with the ferocity of 10 men that day, and every soldier who had walked away from Hill 616 alive owed their survival to one sergeant armed with a mattress cover and a dozen grenades. Dunham stood in silence. His brother, Ralph, was among the assembled audience, along with 40 men from Company the 1 who had survived the Alsace campaign. The European conflict would conclude in 2 weeks. The 3rd Infantry Division had fought from North Africa through Sicily, Italy, France, and into Germany. They had sustained 11,300 casualties, killed and wounded. They had earned 36 Medals of Honor, more than any other division in the war. Yet, on that particular day in Nuremberg, only Russell Dunham occupied the platform. The medical staff had successfully salvaged his feet. The infection in his back wound had abated after 3 weeks of sulfa treatment. The sutures had been removed. The wound had healed into a substantial scar, extending 10 inches across his spine. He would carry fragments of shrapnel in his back for the remainder of his life, small pieces too deeply embedded to extract without risking paralysis. Following the ceremony, Dunham returned to the United States. He was 25 years old. He had enlisted in August of 1940 with his brother Ralph, driven by scarce employment opportunities during the Depression and a modest Army pay of $30 per month. He had endured 4 amphibious assaults, 7 major campaigns, and 2 attempts to escape enemy capture. He had confirmedly eliminated at least 19 enemy combatants. He had sustained 3 wounds. He returned to his home in Illinois. He married a woman named Mary and dedicated 32 years of his life as a benefits counselor for the Veterans Administration in St. Louis. He assisted returning veterans in navigating the bureaucratic system, submitting claims, and accessing medical care. He attended Medal of Honor conventions and reunions with the 3rd Infantry Division. He rarely spoke of his wartime experiences unless directly questioned, and when queried, he consistently offered the same response. He stated he was merely performing his duty. He maintained that any man in Company I would have acted identically. Russell Dunham passed away peacefully in his sleep on the 6th of April 2009 at his residence in Godfrey, Illinois. He was 89 years old. His brother Ralph had preceded him in death by 10 years. Most of the men from Company Y were no longer alive. The war that had profoundly shaped their youth had become ancient history for the majority of Americans. However, the Medal of Honor citation endured. The official record remained, and 120 men who should have perished on Hill 616 in January of 1945 had, instead, lived. If this narrative has resonated with you as it has with us, please do us a favor and click the like button. Every single like signals YouTube to disseminate this story to a wider audience. Subscribe and enable notifications. We are dedicated to unearthing forgotten narratives from dusty archives on a daily basis. Stories of sergeants who saved lives with mattress covers and grenades. Real individuals, genuine heroism. Leave a comment immediately and inform us of your viewing location. Are you watching from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, or Australia? Our community spans the globe. You are not merely a viewer. You are instrumental in preserving these memories. Indicate your location. Share if a family member served. Simply let us know you are here. Thank you for your viewership. And thank you for ensuring that Russell Dunham does not fade into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping to achieve that.